2 p.m. Let's see, we'll ask that the roll be called, okay?
Treasurer Lillard,
Here.
Commissioner Brackett,
Here.
Commissioner Matlock, Commissioner Rader,
Here.
Commissioner Stafford,
Here.
Comptroller Mumpower. Chairman, you have 5 members present.
Okay, so we have a quorum is present, and the next item is adoption of the agenda. Are there any questions or objections, et cetera, with respect to the agenda? And if not, is there a motion to approve?
So moved.
All right, we have motions. Is there a second?
Second.
All right, we have a second. All right, would you call the roll on the motion to adopt the agenda?
Treasurer, as long as there is no electronic participation, you can do voice votes if you wish.
Okay, then we'll do it by voice vote, the efficient way, all right? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the matter is adopted. Next item is public comment. We'll ask Dr. Gentile or the staff if we have any filings for public comment today.
Mr. Chairman, no filings for public comment today.
All right, so let the record reflect that there are none. All right, next item is approval of the minutes. We have the minutes from our previous meeting at the University of Memphis Lambeth campus and on November 6, 2024. Any questions, comments, et cetera, about those draft minutes?
Mr. Chairman, I would offer one
Okay,
revision to the minutes. I recall we did speak during that meeting with regard to the way that the capital expenditure efforts for colleges and universities that don't have a traditional program.
Right.
And I'd ask that the staff go back and reevaluate that process, and that wasn't in the minutes.
All right, so if the staff would make that amendment to the minutes then, the draft minutes, and also follow up on Commissioner Stafford's point there about the review that the staff was going to give to that item. Are there any other matters about the draft minutes? All right, seeing none, the chair would move adoption of the minutes. Is there a second?
Second.
All right, we have a second. Any further discussion? All right, seeing none, all those in favor of adoption of the amendments with the amendment by Commissioner Stafford will say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the matter is adopted. All right, we have our regular calendar at this point, which is transmission of the 2024-25 revised operating budgets, and I guess we have Russell Van Zimmerman here to speak to that matter, the expert.
That's right. Good afternoon, Treasurer, members of the committee. Thank you for having me here
Is your
today.
mic on there, Russell? Let's just make sure it's on.
I think it might be, but I just got to be a little closer.
Maybe speak up into it a little better.
That's right.
Okay.
Good afternoon, members of the committee. Thank you for having me here today. Russell Van Zimmerman, Senior Director of Fiscal Policy, here to talk about the FY24-25 revised operating budgets. As a reminder, THEC is tasked in the appropriations bill annually with collecting the operating budgets from all of our institutions and transmitting them on to finance and administration with comment. So this body's job is not to approve or disapprove of the operating budgets, but merely to make sure that they are streamlined and then passed along to finance and administration. Prior to your reception of these data today, they've gone through the 6 LGI and 2 system governing boards and been approved by those bodies. Oh, thank you.
There we go.
Is that
She's
better?
got the magic touch, okay? All right, okay.
Again, this body's task is to review the data, transmit them on to FNA with any comments. I'll offer a quick reminder of the schedule by which we collect our operating budgets. So in July of each year, we'll collect the proposed operating budgets and bring that to the summer commission meeting. In October, we receive the revised, really November, December, receive the revised operating budgets and bring that to you all in the winter meeting. Looking at the FY24-25 revised operating budgets, the higher education enterprise is set to collect over $5 billion in revenues. You can see that on the screen in front of you there. Majority of that funding, almost 90%, coming from tuition and fees and state appropriations. The remaining, roughly 10% coming from sales and service or other sources. Teaching functions, those top 4 categories you see underneath the expenditures, will account for some 60% of expenditures at our institutions. That's instruction, research, public service, and academic support. The remaining 40% split across student services, institutional support, operations and maintenance, and scholarships and fellowships. Proportionally, we can see that state appropriations as a share of the overall funding has increased from where it was 5 or 10 years ago. So if you're looking at the screen on the far left there, we can see state appropriations accounting for some 36% of funding at our institutions 10 years ago, 40% 5 years ago, 43% today. Conversely, tuition and fees sort of dropping over time, 54% 10 years ago, 50% 5 years ago, 46% today. That's not to say that tuition and fee revenue has not gone up during this time. It certainly has, but state appropriations have gone up just as much, if not in some cases more. So it's taking on more of a percent of the funding for our institution. That changing dynamic has been the effort of this state offering great investments to our institutions, especially over the last 5 years. And we'll talk about those more here in a bit. First, I'll pivot briefly to the expenditures that you see in your packet here today. You can see that each budget category, and I've bucketed those first 4 categories into teaching functions, each budget category has been relatively consistent over time. There has been a slight decline in the percent of expenditures going towards those teaching functions, made up by an increase in scholarships and fellowships. So really what we've seen over the last 5 or 10 years is that our institutions, as a share of their budget, are spending more on scholarships. They're doing this either to incentivize enrollment, especially for high-achieving students, or offer discounts, especially for students who might have a bit more need. Take a brief look at the revised revenue. For formula units, we can see a few things. Both our LGIs and UT units expected to make about $1.6 billion in revenue. For the community colleges, you're just over $700 million there. The majority of funding for our community colleges is going to come from state appropriations. For the universities, that's tuition and fees. At the LGIs, it's closer to a 50-50 mix, however. I mentioned earlier that we'd spend a brief moment talking about the differences between the various budget versions. So we have the proposed budget, the revised budget, and then we end the year with the actual budget. And we'll start here with revenue. Looking at the change in revenue between the proposed budget and the revised budget, we can start to see a few trends. And we have the formula units up here on the screen in front of you. Just about every one of our formula units is expecting to make more money in their revised operating budget than they might have allocated in the proposed budget. The extent to which this trend occurs, of course, you can see is varying across institutions types and across academic years, but the trend is relatively consistent. The revised budget always tends to be a little bit more than the proposed budget. Most of this underestimation of the budget is happening in that tuition and fees category. You can see that on the screen in front of you, and these data match up almost perfectly with the data that we saw on the screen before. So what you're seeing is that institutions intentionally under budget the amount that they might expect in tuition revenue in that proposed budget. They'll come back in the revised budget once actual enrollment has occurred and revise the numbers upwards should they need to. Looking at the revised expenditures for this year, we saw this at the high level. In our first slide, roughly 60% of expenditures intended to go towards those teaching functions, the items you see in blue on the screen. Our LGIs expect to spend almost $1.9 billion, community colleges a little over $700 million, our UT institutions $1.5 billion. And again, we'll take a look at how these functions have changed between the proposed and the revised budget. All 8 budget categories that you see in front of you there are expected to increase from the proposed to the revised budget here today. And what we're seeing here is really 2 things. First, as I noted a few moments ago, our institutions will intentionally maybe underestimate the number of students they might serve in a given year and then revise that number upwards when they come back to us with the second budget. That's going to impact not just their revenues, but also their expenditures. So increased students means increased expenditures on instruction, academic support, student services, scholarship and fellowships, those things that are tied pretty neatly to enrollment. Additionally, we know that in the proposed budget, our institutions are not necessarily accounting for prior year's dollars. That happens in the revised budget. So you may have a multi-year project those dollars don't show up in the proposed budget, but they'll show up in the revised budget. A good example of this is the $170 million that the state passed for the ERP system. That happened in spring of 2021. Those dollars are still out there. When you see the institutional support there, I suspect a pretty decent chunk of that is actually ERP money that our institutions are putting into the budget and allowing them to spend it as they go through that process. Yes, sir.
Mr. Chairman, for clarification, ERP being the Enterprise Resource Planning, the banner programs that are at our institutions or what have you that collect and gather and track every bit of the system at our institutions. Our universities right now are getting a new ERP, and that's funded by the state. The background there.
Talk briefly about discount rates at our institutions. It's been a bit of a topic over the last year or so. We know that every institution in our state offers some amount of scholarship and fellowship to their students. They do this, again, for two reasons: to incentivize enrollment, especially for higher achieving students, or to offer subsidies, especially for lower income students. Discount rates vary by institution and year, and I'll offer three examples on the screen in front of you that might help make this point a bit more clear. So we can start, naturally, we have TSU. You can see if you go back to 2021, 22, TSU's discount rate was in the single digits as a percent, maybe 5, 8, 9%. In 22, 23, they had a change in policy. They went from an institution that spent between 5 and 10 million a year on scholarships and fellowships to an institution that spent almost $40 million a year in scholarships and fellowships. So that discount rate went, again, from single digits up to almost 50%. TSU is not the only institution to have increased their discount rate in this time, although certainly it's more dramatic than some of the others we'll see on the screen. But Tennessee Tech has a similar upward trend during this time. That's actually the implementation of their presidential scholars. So about 3 or 4 years ago, the institution created a scholarship for high achieving students. It's between $3,000 and $10,000 per student. That scholarship has increased their discount rate. Not every institution is increasing. We also see ETSU here. ETSU, probably about 5 years ago, noticed that their discount rate was maybe higher than some of their peers and have intentionally worked to bring that discount rate down over time. I'll say that what matters here is not so much the discount rate itself, but how that discount rate is related to net tuition per FTE. So you could have a high discount rate or a low discount rate. As long as you're earning enough money per student to keep the doors open, it doesn't tend to be much of an issue. And even some of the institutions, looking at perhaps Tennessee Tech from the previous slide, their discount rate had gone up. Their net tuition per FTE has maintained consistent. So they're still earning the same amount of money per student as maybe they ever have been. Austin P, an example, their discount rate on the previous slide had also been going up. They've actually increased their net tuition per FTE over this time, so they're doing a little bit better. You can see, of course, TSU's net tuition per FTE dropped during this time, probably related to that dramatic increase in the discount rate. Looking at appropriations, every one of our formula units is up in appropriations from where they were 5 years ago, and in some cases, up pretty dramatically. Collectively, these institutions are up about $500 million over this 5-year period. Even adjusted for inflation, that number is still almost $300 million. We'll balance out a little bit by looking at appropriations per FTE, and so this will help you understand how much money they might be getting from the state on a per student basis. Of course, the state does not fund on a per FTE basis, but it helps us compare across our different institutions. And I can add in the FTE data to help illustrate a few points here. At UTK, for example, this is an institution that has done pretty well in the formula over the last 5 years, but also increased their enrollment pretty dramatically in the last 5 years. So when you do the per FTE calculation, it's actually muting some of the effects that we might expect to see for successful formula units. Over time, that'll balance itself back out. Conversely, we have the University of Memphis, also an institution that's done pretty well in the formula, maybe some slight declines in FTE there as well, and so it's maybe overstating the appropriations per FTE relative to what we might have expected. I have two more slides for you, looking back at last year's budget to iterate some of the points that I had made earlier. First, we can see a continuing trend that I had referenced, which is that the revised budget tends to be higher than the proposed budget. Looking at revenue, the actual budget, when we get last year's data locked in, tends to be higher than the revised budget. So our institutions are constantly proposing or revising their budget to be just a little bit smaller than maybe they actually might experience. That's combined with, on expenditures, our institutions tend to actually spend less than they might say in the revised budget, right? So this idea that they're allocating more on the expenditure side than they'll actually spend and allocating less on the revenue side than they actually expect to make allows them to have that flexibility that they need to remain, financially solvent institutions. With that, I'll defer to the committee for any questions.
Okay, thank you for that good presentation, Russell. Are there questions or discussion points about Russell's presentation and about the materials accompanying it here?
Chairman.
I've got a few things, but I'll go to Vernon Stafford first here.
Thank you, Russell. As always, you provide us excellent material and excellent analysis. Can you put this in context for me in terms of how we as a state compare to other schools, especially in the Southeast, other states, I should say, in the Southeast, in terms of tuition increases, affordability, and so on?
Great questions. We've done well on both. So we've been below regional and national peers on tuition increases. The data I showed you in the fall said that our tuition increases were in the single digits over the last 5 years, maybe 8 to 10%, well, not quite single digits, 8 to 10% increases over the last 5 years on tuition. Most states are experiencing double or in some cases triple that. Same thing on appropriations. We've done as a state, as I mentioned, very well in the last 5 years in funding our institutions. If you inflation adjust our data over the last 30 years that we've collected it, there's a case to be made that the FY 23-24 budget was the best budget our institutions have ever had in state appropriations. This year's budget, 24-25, the second best. So we've made a lot of progress in a very short amount of time. That's work we're proud of. That's also something that's happening on the student side. We spend $600 million a year in scholarships for our students. That's money directly into students' pockets for any fees that they might have. In terms of per student spending, there's nobody in the nation that spends more than us on scholarships.
Okay, any other questions or thoughts? I just, Dr. Smith, did you have something? Yeah, go on ahead, Commissioner.
I've got a lot of questions, and I thought I had a pretty good idea of what the answers were until you went through what you just went through. Because it strikes me that when we look at the way that institutions allocate their scholarships and fellowships, they're using the institution's money, resources from the tuition and the appropriation to offset the scholarships that they would be expected to raise through private resources. Is that a reasonable statement?
The dollars shown here are unrestricted. If you were to have, say, a donor who gives to an institution with a particular scholarship in mind, that would fall into the restricted budget. So generally speaking, yes, you're correct.
So if an institution is spending 15-20% on their scholarships and fellowships, then they took that off of the resources that they would have invested in for the faculty and for other academic elements. Is that a reasonable conclusion?
Here's where I would say it gets a little bit stickier because the scholarship...
Which is why I started much more hesitant than when I came into the room, so.
Certainly it's possible, and the way the budget lays these data out, to conceptualize our scholarships and fellowships as dollars that the institutions are spending. What I'll say is that the way the institutions tend to think about it is more of a foregone revenue, that these are dollars that maybe we could have made but didn't make because we offered a discount to the student. And the calculation that the institution might make is that but for that discount, that student may not have been here at all. We wouldn't have any of the dollars.
Right, which is why the FTE per student is probably the better marker.
That's right.
Well, I think one of our responsibilities is to pay attention to possible red flags in the trends at institutions, so that we don't have another TSU or any of our institutions. And a lot of the ways that institutions look at is how much they're given in the discount rate in and of itself. And in private institutions, isn't the average now over 50%?
That's correct, yeah.
So they're taking the revenue that they're bringing in from tuition, and in those cases, they don't even have state appropriation, and handing half of that money back to other students, leaving the burden to the remaining half. That's for private institutions. Is that a reasonable statement?
Yeah, potentially.
Okay? And in a smaller way, the public institutions are doing the same thing. We're taking those tuition dollars and appropriated dollars from the taxpayers, and we're giving them to other students to benefit from that. Where we would have been, or had expected that that money be invested in the enterprise in and of itself, particularly the academic side. So in the overview here, one of the points, and I understand that percentages can be incredibly misleading, but over the 10 years, you've pointed out that we were funding the academic teaching functions on campus at about 59.8%, and 10 years ago it was at 63%, and the next sentence is funding to scholarships increased from 5 to 8% over the same time.
Yeah.
So is it too simple to say that there's evidence here that where we would have invested in our faculty and would have invested in our teaching functions, we've chose to buy more students?
What I'll say is the 10-year comparison there might be tricky for you. So we use the 5-year, 10-year comparison in all of our sheets, and depending what that 5th or 10th year is, it could be pretty helpful or maybe less helpful. I mentioned, for instance, that if you inflation adjust appropriations and look over the last 30 years, this year and last year are maybe two of the best years we've had on record. Some of the worst years we've had on record would be following the 2008 housing collapse, including a year like 2014, 2015. So what you may be seeing is that institutions are spending more on scholarships today than they were 10 years ago, but they may be spending actually a very similar amount to what they were, for instance, 20 years ago. If you can imagine in 2014 that the state appropriations have declined as a relative share, maybe they're just able to spend less on scholarships in that time period.
Well, in our fiduciary responsibility and to monitor from these data, what should we be looking at in terms of scholarships and fellowships as being a reasonable expenditure, and where we would put greater emphasis upon the raising of the private dollars, or at least downsizing the institution to more efficient numbers? Because it isn't, I mean, there is a point where just buying more students, and I know I'm being graphic in the way in which I'm describing this. And by the way, in a previous life, I did exactly that.
I would say on the tuition discount, there are two concerns that this body might ought to have. The first, I put up on the chart in front of you, net tuition per FTE.
Right.
I don't know that we would want our tuition discounting to actually impact the institution's bottom line. So we're expecting you to maintain net tuition per FTE or maybe even increase it over time. The other, of course, this body sets the binding tuition ranges each year. And one of the conversations we'll have with the institution is not just how much might you want in an additional tuition increase for this upcoming year, but how much might you need to allow for this kind of discounting. So again, we'll talk about when I come to you all in November, a $1 increase in tuition might actually only generate 80 cents. I think this body can decide to what extent they use that information to make a decision on binding tuition.
Well, the point here is to find where those red flags are appearing here. And one of the comments you made was that ETSU used their data to make a decision that they were exceeding what they were comfortable with.
Right.
I think that was a great move on their behalf. And I don't think it's hurt them financially in other ways, has it?
Not in the data we can see, no.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. Russell, I want to ask you about, look at Tennessee State just a minute here. I've read the staff report in its entirety here and the accompanying graphs and such. We note at the bottom of the first page here, towards the end of that discussion, it says, while the average of locally governed institutions reported expected revenue that was 1.7% higher than their proposed budget, Tennessee State's expected revenue declined 15.5% from their proposed to their revised budgets. And over on the next page, we discuss the fact that it says, while almost all institutions, including formula and specialized units, have revised budget expenditures that do not exceed revenues plus reserves, this is not the case for TSU, which is obvious from the reports you've got here. And at the bottom, in terms of our recommendation that is before this committee, we talk about the fact that our recommendation would be, the commission's recommendation ultimately would be submitted along with appropriate commentary to the Commissioner of Finance and Administration. And I'm just wondering what the commentary should be, if any, on this issue at TSU. Now, I understand that the president of TSU, the interim president, and the board of directors, board of trustees is considering the longer-term plan for TSU, and I don't mean to usurp their thinking about that, but I think, I think it would behoove us to have some discussion about, for instance, one of the bases of higher education in Tennessee, to me, public higher education, has been, for all of the history that I've been aware of it, is that we expect our institutions to stay within their approved budget and to work within that, and that obviously hasn't worked out for TSU here. But, whatever occurs in that regard in terms of the ultimate operating budget that's approved, whether by the General Assembly or whatever, for this, is going to have a bearing from a historical precedent standpoint on what we expect from all other higher education institutions in Tennessee. And I'm just a little curious, what commission members and the staff may think about, what the commentary might be or should be with respect to that. Yes, Dr. Gentile.
Mr. Chairman, we've been talking a lot internally about what these operating budgets are telling us now versus what they've told us in the past. And for me, a lot, I wanted to interject a lot in this presentation, but I decided not to Russell's benefit. We see a lot about the TSU story and these numbers that we have right now and the numbers that we got 6 months ago. One thing that stands out to me in comparing proposed to revised was just how much the state did not know about the finances of TSU 6 months ago, and I go so far as to argue that TSU did not as well. And looking at scholarships and fellowships for TSU and the proposed budget that we got in July 1, it was $20 million is what they had down for scholarships, and now it's at $35 million. That is not because they made a decision to increase scholarshiping over that time. It was because Alicia Fox, the CFO at Tennessee Board of Regents, has been on the ground there ever since then, alongside the consulting firm that's helping out TSU right now, getting to the bottom of what their finances are, and discovering that actually the scholarshiping was at $35 million, not $20 million. What stands out to me is that these numbers that we get from our institutions are only as good as what they submit to us and is approved by their governing board. The state, right now, I do not think has sufficient perspective on the finances that come in from our institutions as we should, and primarily that's with an eye towards TSU. We've known that they, back in fall '22, used COVID relief funding to increase their scholarshiping. That led to enrollment growths, but we did not know to what extent TSU did not know about their internal finances. So for me, with regards to comment to send on, prior budgets that we've gotten from TSU are not as sufficiently helpful. Going forward, they will be. And we expect that of all higher education institutions too.
So yes, I agree with Dr. Gentile that it's a tough situation we face at TSU, but we may have some good result in the sense that everyone may know more about what the budget situation truly is, including whoever is running the institution, because you can't make appropriate financial decisions without having a base of solid information on which to do that. And I'll preface my remarks here today by saying, from my standpoint, TSU is an important historic institution in Tennessee. And I think everybody in Tennessee, whether it's me or whoever else is looking at it, we want TSU to survive and thrive is what we want to have happen. And but on the other hand, I just wonder again whether in terms of commentary, like if we were to vote for these budgets and send them on to the commission, and the commission ultimately sends that on to the commissioner of F&A and to the governor, whether expected commentary would be, that we, as a general rule, expect every institution in the state to operate within their own approved budget, and there are other revenues that they have that are part of that budget. And I'll comment that this is not any different. This is not any different and not any harder than anybody else in state government. We have numerous state agencies, including the Treasury Department that I head. And let's just say that the dog wouldn't hunt if I decided I was going to overspend substantially the budget of the Treasury Department. Let's just say that would be a major league problem in a rather short period of time. So, every commissioner, every agency director, every constitutional officer is expected to operate within the approved budget approved by the governor and the General Assembly. So any further thoughts or comments about that? So I would suggest that it's appropriate for us as a committee to consider specifically making a statement in connection with our commentary on this, that we expect every institution to operate within their approved budget, including such other revenues as may be appropriately included in that, and look at that as a basic operating thing that needs to be reaffirmed at this point, because I wouldn't want any later institution to come in here and say, well, yes, we overspent our budget by $200 million or whatever it is, but we're expecting the state to make that up, the taxpayers of Tennessee to make that up, we need to make sure that we reinforce what the basic general rule is. I recognize that as part of a workout plan, if you will, or whatever comes out of the ultimate review by the president of TSU and the Board of Trustees, there may be some workout plan, if you will, that involves some injection of further revenues, and we've already done that. The state's already injected at least $30 million into TSU at this point, but that may not be the end of it. Any comments on the proposed commentary that we expect every institution to operate within their approved budget and revenues? Okay, all right. Okay, any other comments or commentary? I would move to amend our recommendation with respect to the operating budgets to include that commentary, and I'll leave the staff to distill it down, okay, to the appropriate language, all right? Let's see, I'll move that as an amendment. Is there a second for the amendment? All right, we have a second for an amendment from Commissioner Matlock. And I'll ask if there's any further comment on the amendment at this point. Seeing none, all those members in favor of the amendment will signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. All right, the amendment is adopted. Back on the budgets as amended here and the conveyance documents as amended. Is there any further commentary or other questions that any member has about these documents at this point and about our proposed recommendation to the commission, the full commission, of conveying these, having the executive director transmit these budgets along with that commentary to the Commissioner of Finance and Administration and the Governor for review? All right, if there isn't any, I move to adopt the amended recommendation. Is there a second? All right, we have seconds, a couple of seconds there. All right, any further discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor of the amended recommendations specify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the amended recommendation is adopted. All right. So, any other issues or discussion on that particular point about the operating budgets? Russell, was there anything further you wanted to add at this point?
Yes, sir.
Okay. All right. Any other business to come before our committee today?
Mr. Treasurer.
All right,
just-
Dr. Gentile.
Just two updates from our November commission meeting. At our last commission meeting, there was sufficient conversation, substantial conversation about our tuition recommendation, our tuition model. As I've told each of you on the phone, we had intended to have a conversation about binding tuition ranges at this meeting. However, the budget not quite out yet. My recommendation is going to be that we have a special called meeting later this winter to discuss that. However, another discussion point was about the tuition model and just re-looking at that, and the treasurer and my fiscal policy team and I met earlier in January to talk about that. We have been in contact with the group that helped create this tuition model way back when Dr. Deaton was on staff here at THEC in the aughts. So we're continuing that conversation as well. Look forward to bringing that here in the future. And second, to Commissioner Stafford's question at the beginning about the role of research in capital process, Dr. Julie Roberts, our Chief Academic Officer, has been working with our architect, our facilities team, to address that in our instructions, which are not ready to go out yet by any means, but we'll have an update on that in the future too. Sir, that's all I have.
Okay. Does anyone have anything else for the committee at this point? All right. Seeing none, Chair will move that we adjourn. Is there a second? All right, second. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. We're adjourned. Thank you for your service to THEC and to the state of Tennessee.